Back in August, something strange happened.
Nearly 85,000 bags of radioactive contamination.
A frozen shrimp sold at Walmart.
Long-term exposure could increase cancer risk.
Walmart shrimp was radioactive, and the FDA was telling people all over the United States to throw it away. The most shocking thing, though, was what they weren't saying. How? How on earth did the shrimp become radioactive? What kind of mistake could even cause something like this? Or perhaps, was it something more intentional? At the time, answers were nowhere to be found, and within days it seemed most people had forgotten that it had even happened, moving on to the next attention-grabbing headline. But we didn't forget, and luckily, neither did the investigators who solved this mystery. The alert originally came from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Multiple shipping containers were flagged for abnormal radiation levels all over the country at ports in LA, Houston, Savannah, and Miami. Following the alert, the FDA conducted laboratory testing on both the containers and the shrimp inside, which confirmed contamination of cesium-137. Any detection of this cesium isotope in food triggers a serious investigation, because this radioactive isotope doesn't exist in nature on its own, and has no business being in food or any food production and processing. Cesium-137 is a radioactive isotope created during nuclear fission, when heavier elements like uranium split apart inside nuclear reactors or nuclear weapons. Because it does not exist in large amounts naturally, when it is detected in the environment, it signals contamination from a man-made nuclear source. And again, this isotope being inside food is extremely rare and dangerous. Cesium-137 has a half-life of about 30 years, which means it remains radioactive for a long time and can persist in ecosystems, soil, and food chains. So you can see why countries would be frantic about finding the source of this contamination. If it's not contained in time and spreads to other places, its decay could be a huge health issue. The decaying of cesium-137 releases two types of radiation: beta particles, which can damage skin and tissues at close range, and gamma rays, which are far more penetrating and can move through the body and surrounding materials. Externally, a strong source nearby could expose someone to penetrating gamma radiation. Internally, the risk becomes much greater. If someone ingests or inhales cesium-137, the isotope can enter the bloodstream and settle into soft tissues. From there, it continues to irradiate surrounding cells. This chronic low-level internal exposure is dangerous because radiation can break chemical bonds, damage DNA, and steadily increase the risk of cancer over time. So, what did the US government do about this national health risk? In a dramatic speech on the Senate floor, Senator John Kennedy stood in front of a still image from the movie Alien and warned Americans,
Mr. President, this is a photograph of the alien from the movie Alien. This is what you could end up looking like if you eat some of the raw, frozen shrimp being sent to the United States by other countries. If you eat it, how could you end up looking like the alien in the Alien? Because the shrimp was radioactive. I kid you not. It had a radioactive isotope in it called cesium-137. It'll kill you. Even if it doesn't turn you into the alien if you eat this stuff, I guarantee you'll grow an extra ear. This shrimp is grown in conditions that you can't possibly imagine. Dirty water. They shoot the shrimp full of antibiotics. I confess I didn't know they were shooting them full of this radioactive isotope.
Now, sorry to burst anyone's bubble, but no, cesium-137 exposure would not actually turn you into an alien, cause an alien to erupt from your chest, or even cause you to grow an extra ear. While cesium-137 can be harmful at high doses or with prolonged internal exposure, there is no scientific basis for mutations or physical deformities, and certainly nothing resembling the sci-fi imagery Kennedy claimed. So, since Kennedy seems to be just as equally confused as he is confusing, let's have a look at two documented cases of cesium-137 exposure and see what horrors it's truly capable of. The Goiânia accident, which occurred in September 1987 in the Brazilian state of Goiás, is considered one of the worst radiological accidents in history. It began when two scrap metal scavengers, Roberto dos Santos Alves and Wagner Mota Pereira, broke into an abandoned private clinic for cancer treatment on the night of September 13, 1987, and found a teletherapy machine. They didn't know what the device was, only that it looked valuable, so they dismantled it enough to move it and took the device to Roberto's home in a wheelbarrow. That night, both thieves began feeling sick. Roberto and Wagner were both vomiting, but Wagner was in worse shape. He was experiencing diarrhea while feeling dizzy. His left hand was also swelling up suspiciously. But when Wagner Pereira went to get checked out by a doctor 2 days later on the 15th of September, he was sent home with a diagnosis of food poisoning. The next day, Roberto was successful in opening up the device and found a small capsule. He then broke the capsule open with a screwdriver, revealing the substance inside that was glowing in a deep blue tone. To someone who had no idea what it was, it must have looked downright mystical. Roberto went on scooping it out of the capsule to have a closer look. The substance was powdery, so he thought maybe it was a cool type of gunpowder. He tried a lighter to test it out, but it wouldn't ignite. Roberto and Wagner ended up selling the device to a scrapyard owned by Dever Alves Ferreira. Dever was so intrigued by the glowing material that he brought it to his house and showed the mysterious blue glowing substance to his family and neighbors. That night, his wife Maria Gabriela started feeling sick, but they didn't think anything of it. A week went by with the glowing capsule admired and handled by many. His brother, Ivo, even scooped some of it up to take to his home nearby and spread it on the floor where his daughter liked to sit. The 6-year-old girl, Lady das Neves Ferreira, admired the blue light coming from the powder, eating an egg while watching its shiny glow, and even smearing some of the powder on her body to show her mother how she could glow too. Lady, along with her mother Lourdes, also got sick. In the meantime, Dever was able to sell the capsule to another scrapyard, but his wife Maria Gabriela couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. She had begun to notice that so many people around them had been feeling so severely ill all of a sudden. With news of her sister-in-law also getting sick, she took the medical device from the scrapyard Dever sold it to and brought it to the hospital to have it checked out. By that time, it had been 15 days since the radiotherapy device had been stolen. Thanks to a visiting medical physicist's scintillation counter, the hospital quickly confirmed that the substance was radioactive and immediately notified government officials. But the work ahead was insurmountable. Over the course of several days, dozens of people had been exposed to the radioactive substance before authorities realized a radiological event was unfolding. People had touched it, rubbed it on their skin, carried it from house to house, let children play with it. The glowing substance was in a dust form and had transferred easily to hands, hair, furniture, and anything it came in contact with families unknowingly spreading microscopic particles of cesium-137 through houses, clothes, food, and even soil that it had accidentally been sprinkled on. And what happens when these people were exposed to cesium-137, you might ask? In this case, the radioactive isotope harmed people in two main ways: external gamma exposure and internal contamination. The glowing blue powder emitted strong gamma radiation, which penetrates deeply into the body, damaging tissues and organs even from a distance. But the bigger danger came from internal contamination, when people like Ivo's 6-year-old daughter, Lady, accidentally ingested the cesium dust when she was eating an egg on the floor after playing with the magical glowing glitter. Once inside the body, cesium gets distributed widely throughout soft tissues, especially muscle. This internal irradiation continues for as long as the isotope remains inside the person, delivering radiation that damages DNA and rapidly dividing cells. And, well, there's no easy way to get it out of the cells once it's in. The girl had to be taken from her home by an international team of experts to the hospital, where she was confined to an isolation room due to the medical staff's fear of being exposed themselves. The little girl's whole upper body swelled up, and her kidneys and lungs shut down. She suffered internal bleeding, while her hair fell out in clumps. With nothing left to do for Lady, on October 23rd, 1 month after she was first exposed to the cesium, she passed away from generalized infection and septicemia, or blood poisoning. In addition to Lady's unfortunate death, with the news of the incident being broadcast on local and national channels, worried Goianians crowded in hospitals to get checked out in fear that they had been exposed. Out of almost 130,000 people, 249 were found to be contaminated by the cesium-137. Some of them even still had some residue found on their skin, and 20 of those people had to undergo treatment for radiation sickness. The two thieves, Roberto and Wagner, got off relatively easy. Wagner, who was sent home with a food poisoning diagnosis, had held the capsule in his hand and had a burn in the same shape and size of the capsule's aperture. Doctors had to amputate several of his fingers in order to save the rest of his hand. Roberto, on the other hand, had it worse, since he had tinkered longer with the capsule in order to dislodge it from the device. With the prolonged exposure to the cesium-137, his right forearm became ulcerated and was eventually amputated. While the scrapyard owner, De Ver Ferreira, survived, his wife, Maria Gabriela, who had solved the mysterious illness around her, wasn't so lucky. Even with treatment, she suffered from internal bleeding in her limbs, eyes, and digestive tract. Her hair fell out in clumps like her niece Lady, and she suffered through mental confusion, diarrhea, and renal insufficiency before passing away from septicemia and general infection, just like Lady. The other two people who passed away from the incident were two of De Ver's employees, 18-year-old Edmilson Alves de Souza and 22-year-old Israel Batista dos Santos. They had both worked on the radioactive source to extract different materials for the scrapyard and died within a day of each other. For the remaining people who had been exposed to the radioactive dust, the health effects were severe. Many of them developed acute radiation syndrome, vomiting, diarrhea, profound weakness, skin burns that developed days later, massive organs and tissue damage, and dramatic drops in white blood cells and platelets. And even though most of the people could be treated, cleanup also had to be done for the neighborhood where the glowing blue powder had been passed around. Entire homes had to be demolished, with topsoil removed from several sites. Countless personal belongings were also destroyed to contain the contamination. The Goiânia accident ultimately became a prime example of why cesium-137 is treated so seriously today. It spreads easily, it is nearly invisible once not glowing, it can enter the body through multiple routes, and its gamma emissions can inflict life-threatening damage. Another well-known cesium-137 exposure incident happened in Kramatorsk, Ukraine in the 80s. Over several years, residents of an apartment began suffering unexplained illnesses. 2 teenage children in the family died of leukemia, followed by their mother. When the remaining father moved out, another family moved in with their son, who soon died of leukemia as well. The father of the second family thought something was fishy, so he started demanding answers. Doctors were puzzled because the pattern resembled radiation sickness, but there was no known exposure. The true cause wasn't discovered until 1989, when inspectors brought a Geiger counter to the apartment during a final investigation. The device registered extremely high gamma radiation coming from inside the wall next to the children's room, right by one of their beds. After breaking the concrete open, they discovered that embedded in the wall was a tiny capsule of cesium-137. Investigators eventually found out how it got into the wall in the first place, and we actually have a whole video about it that we'll leave a link to in the description below if you'd like to learn more. But unlike Goiânia, where people were internally contaminated by particles of cesium-137, the Kramatorsk victims had suffered continuous external irradiation from a point source only a few feet away from where they slept. This type of long-term exposure damages bone marrow and rapidly dividing cells, creating a dramatically higher risk of cancers such as leukemia. What officials were worried about in the radioactive shrimp case was ongoing exposure for millions of people if contaminated products entered the food supply. Even small amounts can be radiotoxic if they accumulate in the body, and the gamma radiation it emits can increase long-term cancer risk. They needed to find the source of the cesium-137 contamination as soon as possible. So, how did it get in the shrimp? Well, all of the shipping containers that arrived in LA, Houston, Savannah, and Miami had something in common. They all came from the same place. A supply chain review connected the radioactive shrimp to Indonesian exporter PT Bahari Makmur Sejati, also known as BMS Foods, and subsequently to distributors in the States, including Walmart's Great Value label, Southwind Foods, and Aquastar. And even though no confirmed contaminated packages were found in stores, the FDA issued warnings and recalls to pull the shrimp products off of store shelves out of precaution. The discovery did not begin with a complaint where someone got seriously sick or from random food testing after the shrimp was distributed. Thankfully, radiation monitoring from Homeland Security designed to detect nuclear materials caught the contaminated shrimp shipments before they could ever make it to stores. But detecting the radioactive material and preventing its distribution is only one part of the story. Now, both the US and Indonesian government officials had to trace the investigation back to the origin point. Where in Indonesia did these BMS Foods containers come from? And why were they contaminated? Tracing back the specific containers, BMS Foods found out that the ones that were found to have signs of radioactivity had been passing through an industrial zone called Shikandi Industrial Estate in Banten Province on the island of Java, a little over an hour drive from Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. The government cordoned off the industrial zone entirely. In the meantime, online rumors ran rampant with people debating if the shrimp were contaminated by the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident of 2011. Disaster struck when a massive earthquake triggered a tsunami that ravaged Japan's northeastern coast. The tsunami overwhelmed the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, leading to core meltdowns in 3 reactors. Hydrogen explosions damaged several reactor buildings, and significant amounts of radioactive material escaped into the air and sea. Large releases of iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137 spread across surrounding land and into the Pacific Ocean. This contamination created measurable levels of cesium in seawater and marine organisms near Japan in the years following the accident. The disaster prompted global concern about long-term ocean contamination, especially with cesium-137's 30-year half-life. Contamination in the ocean can also travel long distances in marine currents, and is impossible to really treat once it's inside the water. Which is why years after the incident, Fukushima returned to the news when Japan began releasing treated wastewater from the plant into the Pacific. This water had been stored on-site for over a decade and underwent filtration to remove most radionuclides through a system called ALPS, which stands for Advanced Liquid Processing System. While the filtration removed cesium-137 and most other isotopes, it could not remove tritium, a low-energy radioactive form of hydrogen. Instead, they diluted it heavily with seawater, which is the procedure on how to handle radioactive waste. Japan started to discharge this treated water gradually into the ocean in 2023. This sparked massive controversy and backlash, and reignited fears about radioactive contamination in seafood, despite regulatory approval from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Given this context, when U.S. regulators detected cesium-137 in shrimp shipments, many people assumed a connection to the Fukushima meltdown. However, experts had a different theory. In the Indonesian investigation, one of the most important clues came from shipping containers stored inside the cordoned-off Cikandi Modern Industrial Estate, where the seafood processors for BMS Foods operated. When Indonesian regulators and radiation safety officials began scanning the area, they discovered that several containers sitting inside the industrial zone registered abnormal levels of gamma radiation. According to reporting by The Guardian and AP News, some of these containers measured well above background radiation, strong enough that they immediately signaled the presence of cesium-137, and the location of the containers were concentrated to one spot, near a steel manufacturer company called Peter Metal Technology that processed scrap metal. With the proximity of the metal processing facility, investigators started reconstructing the contamination pathway that led to the irradiated containers sitting in the industrial area. There were a few ways that the contamination might have spread. One possibility is that a lost industrial gauge or medical device containing cesium-137, like in our previous cases from Brazil and Ukraine, might have been unknowingly smelted by the metal processing company. When this happens, the cesium can aerosolize or fragment into fine particles that settle onto nearby surfaces, like the shipping container sitting outside. The ways that cesium-laden dust or metal particulates could have spread beyond the smelter's property by wind, foot traffic, shared equipment, or movement of materials, just like how the blue powder was easily spread in the Goiânia case. If this theory is correct, it would explain how the contamination remained in the industrial area instead of appearing broadly across Indonesia's coastlines or shrimp farms, which would have been a massive issue altogether. Thankfully, the contaminated containers actually were evidence against the theory that the radioactive material was coming from the ocean. But can it be proven that this is actually what happened? The way scientists can often distinguish the origin of cesium contamination is by looking at the ratio of cesium-134 to cesium-137. Nuclear reactor accidents like Fukushima release a mixture of both isotopes. Cesium-134 has a short half-life of about 2 years, meaning it decays quickly. After Fukushima in 2011, seawater and fish near Japan showed a recognizable fingerprint, elevated cesium-137 accompanied by detectable cesium-134. Even more than a decade later, trace amounts of cesium-134 could still confirm that the contamination originally came from a reactor accident, because cesium-134 does not exist in significant amounts in weapons test fallout or most industrial sources. This dual isotope presence creates a signature that can be used to link contamination to a meltdown event. Industrial radiological sources, however, such as medical teletherapy devices, density gauges, well logging tools, or scrap metal containing orphan cesium-137 capsules, typically contain pure cesium-137 with no cesium-134 present. When such a source is accidentally melted in a smelter or broken open, the resulting contamination shows a single isotope profile, cesium-137 alone. Investigators examining the Indonesian shrimp-related contamination reported that the cesium detected did not show a dual isotope signature, no cesium-134, only 137. This strongly suggested a local industrial origin, not a reactor meltdown like Fukushima. Now that officials knew where the contamination was coming from, they could then move on to mitigating the damage. The first step, getting in contact with a steel manufacturing company, was an unexpected issue for them. The theory of an accidentally smelted cesium capsule being the culprit was very likely, but getting Peter Metal Technology to open up for investigation? That wasn't going to happen. Not wanting to admit to negligence, the management of the company had fled to China, as the police launched a criminal investigation. It appeared that 20 factories linked to the Chikandi industrial estate were affected by the contamination. The facility that processes shrimp was only a mile away from the metal smelting facility, and another facility manufacturing footwear in the area was tied to boxes of sneakers flagged for traces of radiation by Dutch authorities in the Netherlands earlier in the year. Hanif Faisal Nurafik, Indonesia's environment minister, explained that the radiation level measured in Chikandi reached 1,000 microsieverts. In an interview with Nuclear Newswire, Steve Bigalki, chair of nuclear and radiological engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology, said, 50 hours in such an environment would give us our annual worker dose within the United States. 9 employees working in the area were found to have exposure to cesium-137 and subsequently treated at Jakarta in a government hospital. With the industrial area decontaminated, a radiation monitoring portal was installed in Jakarta to prevent this from happening again.
The damn stuff's radioactive.
So how true were Kennedy's claims about this radioactive contamination?
Called cesium-137. It'll kill you. Even if it doesn't turn you into the alien if you eat this stuff, I guarantee you'll grow an extra ear.
The FDA's limit for cesium-137 in food is 1,200 becquerels per kilogram. The samples from the shipping containers measured around 68 becquerels per kilogram, meaning it was more than 17 times lower than the level considered concerning for human health. The FDA has also stated that no illnesses have been reported. So while the recall was absolutely the right move from a food safety perspective, there was no need for people to panic. Kennedy's claims that the radioactive contamination would cause deaths if eaten was not true. A lethal radiation dose requires either sustained internal exposure or proximity to a high-activity source, such as a lost industrial capsule. Even if someone hypothetically ate shrimp at the measured contamination level, the dose would be negligible, orders of magnitude below what is known to cause radiation sickness, cancer, or organ damage.
They shoot the shrimp full of antibiotics. I confess I didn't know they were shooting them full of this radioactive isotope.
His assertion that Indonesia was injecting the shrimp full of radioactive isotopes and antibiotics is also factually wrong. The radioactive isotope was not injected into shrimp or used in aquaculture. The contamination was surface level in the form of dust. And lastly, Kennedy claimed that the contaminated shrimp had been sold inside the U.S.
The FDA and NOAA, which I'll talk about in a second, found that there were 26,460 packages of shrimp cocktail and 18,000 bags of frozen cooked shrimp being sold once again at Walmart and at Kroger's throughout the United States, containing the same radioactive isotope. How could this happen in America? This is unconscionable.
Even though Kennedy said that Walmart and Kroger sold the radioactive shrimp, in actuality, no confirmed contaminated products ever made it onto store shelves. Border Patrol would have detected the radiation before that. Despite this, retailers still voluntarily pulled products from the shelves just because they came from the same Indonesian supplier, not because they tested positive. Another question with this whole thing is, why does the US have to import shrimp all the way from Indonesia? The United States does catch and farm some of its own shrimp, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. Louisiana historically lands some of the highest volumes of wild shrimp, followed by Texas, Alabama, and Florida. Yet domestic production covers only a small fraction of what Americans consume, and shrimp is the single most popular seafood in the country.
Shrimp is the fruit of the sea. You can barbecue it, boil it, broil it, bake it, saute it. There's shrimp kebabs, shrimp creole, shrimp gumbo, pan fried, deep fried, stir fried. There's pineapple shrimp, lemon shrimp, coconut shrimp, pepper shrimp, shrimp soup, shrimp stew, shrimp salad, shrimp and potatoes, shrimp burger,
shrimp sandwich.
The thing is, global exporters can ship huge volumes at lower costs than American shrimpers can match. This has caused domestic fleets to shrink over the years, as fuel prices, labor costs, and increasingly severe storms in the Gulf make shrimping more expensive and risky. Domestic shrimp farming is also limited due to more land costs, regulatory requirements, and environmental considerations compared to countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and India, where aquaculture dominates the seafood economy. The large-scale pond farming that they do year-round would be extremely difficult and expensive to replicate in the US. As a result, more than 90% of shrimp eaten in the US is imported, largely from Southeast Asia and even Latin American countries like Ecuador and Mexico. If Americans were to theoretically source more of their shrimp from domestic fisheries, consumers would need to accept higher prices and more seasonal availability. At the end of the day, looking at the big picture, with the size of their national appetite for shrimp, Americans lean heavily on foreign aquaculture. Framing isolated rejected batches as proof that imported shrimp is unsafe and then imposing tariffs that raise prices across the board ultimately leaves consumers paying more for less. And that's not really great value, is it? Thanks for watching. Before you go, we want to share a quick but important update following our last video about the internet sleuths who caught a cannibal. That video covered a controversial story that genuinely needed exposure. Unfortunately, it was demonetized. And as we continue to make videos like this that shine a light on uncomfortable but important truths, the risk of having our revenue shut off at any moment becomes very real. Still, these stories matter, and we don't plan on stopping. If you'd like to support us in continuing this work, then we'd like to invite you to join us over on stacked.com/brew. Stacked is a platform similar to Patreon, except it takes a smaller cut from creators' donations while providing the same service. For $5 a month, members get access to behind-the-scenes production discussions, ad-free and sponsor-free versions of our YouTube videos, and bonus videos that simply wouldn't be possible on YouTube due to the algorithm. Nothing on YouTube will change. This just gives those who want to have an extra way to support the channel and get extra content in return. You can become a member by going to stacked.com/brew or by clicking the link in the description below. Thanks to our Stacked members who have already joined. It's because of fans like you that make this channel possible. And a big special thanks to our top tier members, Nexus and Border Lodge. See you folks on the next one.